To coincide with the new release of Operation Bagration for Flames of War, I thought it would be a good opportunity to tackle some Finnish armour. So in this video, I'll be showing you how I painted the Stug, and I'll be using the Vallejo range of paints to do so. Before I started painting, I first of all began prepping the model with a primer. This is so that the later layers of paint adhere to the miniature surface. For this step, I chose to use a black primer, as this would create the appearance of shadows in some of those harder to reach areas, like those around the tank tracks and between the armor panels. Next, I began the actual painting by applying a dry brush of stone grey over the entirety of the model. Dry brushing involves loading up a fairly large brush with some paint and removing some of the excess onto a tissue or a piece of paper until only a small amount of paint remains in the bristles. With my dry brush ready, I used a series of quick but light brush strokes over the whole miniature. The paint accumulated onto the hard edges and flat surfaces, but left the recessed areas dark. I repeated this step a couple of times and even switched to a smaller brush to access those hard to reach areas. As you can see, this is a very quick and easy step to perform and left me with one of the three colours for the three-tone camouflage that I'll be building up in the next few steps. The next camouflage colour to apply was olive green, but I wasn't going to be applying it straight from the bottle. Instead, I thinned down the paint by mixing in just a little bit of water. Vallejo paints are quite rich, so even when they're thin, they still have good coverage. With the paint thinned, I started to sketch out the edges of the green bands that made up the camouflage pattern. These snake across the entire surface of the tank, helping to break up the profile. I found it particularly helpful here to use a reference photo to make sure that the paint is being applied in a realistic pattern. Once the edges had been defined, I could fill in the areas between them. Personally, I found that predefining the lines to be much simpler as I was copying a pattern, but you can approach this however you prefer. With the olive green bands applied, I next repeated the same process but using the brown of flat earth instead. Like before, I thinned out the paint with some water and then sketched out the edges. These bands were then filled in to create the finished camouflage pattern. With the camouflage pattern completed, I could begin to work on some of the details of the tank. The first of these were the tracks, and I began with a base coat of flat brown. This reddish brown colour will help to create the basis for a rusted metal effect that I'll build upon a bit later on. To paint the logs strapped to either side of the Stug and also any wooden parts of the stowage items, I used some German camo medium brown. I kept the cut ends of the logs as the original stone grey to create a lighter inner tree colour. The next areas to paint were a combination of the rubber areas as well as the bare metal sections. For both of these, I used the very dark grey of black grey. I prefer to use this rather than a pure black, as it means that I can benefit from a black wash later on, something that a pure black wouldn't. Following on from the previous application of the black grey, I then began to pick out those metal areas with an edge highlight of the metallic paint gunmetal. I lightly dragged my brush over some of the black grey details to create a fine edge highlight. This resulted in a blackened steel effect. Similarly, I applied the same paint over the tank's tracks. Combined with the original red oxide base layer, I now had the appearance of rusted metal. Once I had completed this step, I made sure to thoroughly clean my brushes and change my paint water to avoid contamination of metal flakes into my other paints. With all of the base coats completed, I would now apply some washes. These are great for boosting the visibility of details as they will flow into the recessed areas and create the appearance of shadows. The first wash that I applied was sepia wash, but like the other paints that I had used, it was a little too strong to be used straight from the pot. So I first needed to water it down a little with just a little bit of water. Once thinned, I then began to apply this over the entirety of the tank's armour, as well as the logs and wooden stowage items. Washes can tend to pool in some places, leaving undesirable staining, so I made sure that I didn't apply too much at a time and tried to evenly spread it out. Finally, I applied some black wash, thinned in the same manner as before. This time I applied it in two ways. The first was an all-over wash to the black-grey details and also the tracks. The second method was a much more localized and targeted application of the wash. Using a fairly small brush, I directly applied some black wash into some of the details on the hull. By darkening down certain details, such as hatches, hinges and panels, I made the shadows look deeper, resulting in the illusion that these details are more pronounced than they actually are, helping to improve the realism of the model. And here we have the completed Finnish Stug, painted in a 3-tone camouflage. Now, whilst I focus on just one specific vehicle in this video, you could easily apply the same colours and techniques to other Finnish World War II vehicles too. You can find a full list of all the paints that I used in this tutorial in the description below, along with any other equipment that I've used to create this video. And if you enjoyed this tutorial, then please do let me know in the comments. And with that, the final thing to say is a massive thank you to my supporters. Currently, my top supporters on Patreon are Jonathan Hart, Stuart Smith, Berserker, Daniel Dowling, Gesteig Panzer, Jake, Jeremy Kaup, Jesse Smith, Casper Strand, Lyconian Primarch, Merrick, Mr. Grimm, Raphael Bayruthi, Nice OJ, and Swedsman. So a big thank you to you guys, and if you also support me on Patreon, buy me a coffee, or you just use my affiliates links, and your help is highly appreciated. If you would like to help me out too, then you can check out my description for all of those relevant links. And so until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.